The BRICS summit is soon to be
There it
upon
is.
us in the next few days. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and it will be in South Africa this year. A lot been happening with the BRICS, of course, and perhaps maybe more relevant, the BRICS summit than it's ever been before, given the geopolitical ructions we are seeing here now. And to discuss this, we are very, very honored to be joined here by Vijay Prashad, who is the director of the Tricontinental Institute. And I have to note here, they just released their new newspaper that, very convenient for us, has the title, "The BRICS Have Changed the Balance of Forces, but they will not by themselves change the world." It's their 33rd newsletter, so go to tricontinental.org and check that out. Vijay, thanks for being with us.
I thought we were going to talk about the 50th anniversary of hip hop.
Well, listen, if you want to give me your top 5 hip hop albums, I'm ready. I'm ready to take them now.
I mean, VJ, are you ready for this? Like, do you really want to go there? We can. We'll
I
just
was
switch
the
it
only
around.
one amongst all of you who was born already when hip hop was born. So there's that. It's been a soundtrack for most of my life, except the first 6 years. So there's that.
VJ
Well,
is one
listen,
of
we
these
will
people
get your
who knows
best
all.
albums. We'll do an all music show. If you don't know, VJ is a great connoisseur of great music. Maybe they'll have some great music at the BRICS Summit. I really don't know. But that being said, obviously there's a lot swirling around this summit. Putin not attending in person. Everything happening with Ukraine, China-India relations. So there's so many different elements to this. I guess my first question for you, VJ, is, what is the significance of the BRICS Summit this year? Is it just looming larger because of the news, or is it really more significant?
Well, it's the 15th BRICS summit. Let's not forget that the BRICS grouping came together when the detritus of the Western banking system looked like it was going to collapse the world economy. And really, that was the motivation for these 5 large countries of the global south and Russia to get together, start having discussions about South South cooperation, particularly in trade. I don't want to oversell the BRICS project because essentially it starts out as a trade alliance, as a way to deal with development, financing, mutual trade, and so on. It then takes on a political role, but the political role is really secondary. I really don't want to oversell the BRICS. I know there's a lot of conversation about it. Now, this year it's significant for both reasons of peace on the one side and development on the other. Both reasons. Why both reasons? Well, after the BRICS was formed in 2009, and about 3-4 years later, things started to deteriorate for the alliance, largely because you saw a long term lawfare campaign against the government of Dilma Rousseff, and then, the arrest of Lula, who had been the president before Dilma, the arrival of the right wing Temer and Bolsonaro in Brazil. So Brazil began to walk away from the BRICS project a little bit. India in 2013 elected a right wing government, still there, Mr. Modi. The Indians began to walk away a little from BRICS. But it became clear because BRICS is principally a trade, commerce, to some extent, development alliance, that despite their political disagreements, there was a lot that held them in common. And that's why BRICS continued to meet, and that's why they discussed and then created 2 important institutions: the new development bank, also called the BRICS Bank, and the contingency reserve arrangement, which was supposed to be an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. The contingency reserve agreement really hasn't gone forward, but the BRICS Bank has been established. The current director, in fact, is Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil. So, for the first thing, in terms of why the BRICS was able to stick together, the development and trade issue held it together. But this year, they are in the thick of debating the question of Ukraine, the Cold War in China, and so on. Lula is back. Lula is really back with a bang. He's up there in the world stage saying, let's talk about important issues. So they're going to discuss the politics, the peace question in particular, but also the development issue. The International Monetary Fund has returned after the pandemic. Harsh development agenda they've placed before a lot of poor countries. China has put a lot of money into circulation for development, produced a kind of alternative The BRICS Bank also there as an alternative. So yeah, it's going to be an important summit. Some problems which we can talk about, but it's going to be an important summit both for development and trade, the anchors of the BRICS project, but also for peace.
VJ, just there's a few things that you said that I'd like for you to elaborate on. And I do think it's important. This is also happening in the context of over a year and a half after Russia's war in Ukraine. And it's kind of like made BRICS a bigger talking point in the mainstream media in the US, at least. And one thing I noticed just kind of perusing the coverage that it's receiving before the fact now is there's been a lot of attention in the corporate mainstream press in the US and in the UK on this, like, they're trying to make, I think, a bigger fight about it than it actually is, about the idea of, oh, there's like an internal debate inside the BRICS countries about who to accept, right? Because you do have a lot of countries across the global south applying for, to be a part of BRICS. Many, in fact. And also, there's a little bit of disagreement about how many countries or who should be let in. And like I mentioned, a lot of like outlets like AP, Reuters, The Economist are kind of making this a bigger deal than maybe it actually is, or maybe it is a big deal. I don't know. But what's your sense of how important this discussion is? Because there are so many countries, including ones that are closely aligned with the US, who are actively trying to join this organization.
Well, look, the world is filled with contradictions, and I think that's how we need to understand things. Most important is that many, many countries, poorer countries, developing countries, some rich countries like Saudi Arabia, many countries see the BRICS as significant. I mean, the fact that they are lining up to join BRICS, I don't want to get into the details. I mean, one of the countries is Argentina. You just had a segment on Argentina with my colleague Zoe. Argentina might have a far right government next. I don't think the Brazilians will be particularly happy to have Argentina as a full fledged member of BRICS with that kind of government. On the other hand, because BRICS is anchored in a trade and development agenda, even a far right government is going to have to deal with the BRICS countries. Look, you know, whatever they might say, the largest trading partner of Argentina is China. You can't get out of that. Australia, Japan, largest trading partner, China, they both joined the regional agreement with China called RCEP. You know, that's the reason why countries that might have some political disagreement with this or that BRICS country nonetheless want to be in on the action. I think that's the first thing. It's not about who's going to enter. The fact is, lots of countries are lining up because they know the BRICS bloc is significant. But let's also shift focus for a second. BRICS is going to take place in South Africa. Currently, major developments taking place in the Sahel region in Africa, these coups in four countries against France, major sentiment, anti imperialist sentiment, you could call it. Maybe it's just anti French sentiment, but it could expand and
Same
develop.
thing, almost.
Protest, well, it's, not necessarily,
Almost.
because we're not seeing, for instance, in Agadez, protests against the US drone base, Airbase 201. It's been largely anti-French kind of protests. The French have got to go. I'd like to see somebody say, well, let the Yank base also go. So far we haven't
Mhm.
seen that. So but this new mood is there across the African continent, and this is going to play in the BRICS summit. It's not possible for the people coming to South Africa not to have to engage with a new mood that is sweeping across the continents of Africa, Asia, Latin America. There's a new feeling in the air. And I think this is going to actually, in a way, radicalize the politics of the BRICS. Um,
Mm.
Look, it's not a question of who joins. Already, the BRICS is not a coherent political body. There's a right wing government in India, and then there's the government of the center left, say, in Brazil. But they have come together to build something together despite their political disagreements. And I, for one, think there's something productive here. It's a little bit like a mini version of the United Nations. 193 countries belong in the UN. But you know that the UN system has had its power seized by the five permanent members of the Security Council: Russia, China, also members of BRICS, but France, Britain, and the United States. There are no Latin Americans who have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. No African country has a permanent seat in the Security Council. And part of the reason, in my opinion, for the emergence of the BRICS is that the door was closed by the permanent members of the Security Council to expansion of the permanent seats there. Brazil has long wanted a seat. South Africa has long wanted a seat. India has long wanted a seat. These are the three other countries in BRICS that are outside the permanent structure of the UN. You got to see it in that perspective. They have national interests which seem to be converging despite political disagreements.
No, very well taken points, especially about Niger. I've actually already seen the anonymous sources from the Elysee Palace leaking to the media that the U.S. is abandoning France for to try to save their own bases. Interesting thing to look at. But speaking of war and peace issues, obviously one of the issues hanging over this is the war in Ukraine. It's in South Africa, the BRICS summit, where of course South Africa is helping to lead the African Peace Initiative that Russia has been, at least a little bit more than lukewarm towards. Brazil obviously been raising the issue of peace very aggressively, and then India and China at least on the record in favor of it. Putin, of course, will not be there in person, but is in close contact with all the leaders of all the countries, it seems. So at the end of the day, are you expecting there to be any potential movement at all on, if not the actuality of peace, at least the narrative of how we could get to more substantive talks?
12 years ago, I wrote an article about how four African heads of state, including the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, were prepared to go to Libya, both to Tripoli to talk to Mr. Gaddafi and to go to Benghazi to talk to, the so-called rebellion leaders, many of them freshly flown in from the Gulf Arab states where they were financial advisors and so on, including Mr. Mahmoud Jibril. But they were blocked. France said you can't take off. In fact, they were treated in a humiliating way. I was interested to see that a few days ago, Mr. Museveni, the president of Uganda, made a public statement reminding the world of how these African heads of state were treated by the West when they tried to enter to negotiate, not in Europe, not in Asia, but on African soil. And they were given a mandate by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. I'm bringing this up in order to say that there's a lot of frustration among African countries, Asian and Latin American. And Mr. Museveni is not a radical guy, although I must say, when he was a student at the University of Dar es Salaam, Mr. Museveni was a student of Walter Rodney, at the time was a Marxist. No longer, not for decades. He's a man of the right. And yet there he is saying, look, you don't treat us with respect and we can't tolerate this anymore. This is the attitude with which they are going to come to Johannesburg and say, we can have a role in the discussions around Ukraine. This is not an issue only for NATO countries and so on. We must have a role. We are member states of the United Nations. And I think Mr. Museveni's statement about Libya is really in the context of the disregard with which billions of people are treated over their views regarding peace and development on the planet. People want to say, that's about it. Now, what they are saying, debate them, engage them, don't silence them, but they get silenced, and that creates resentment.
Vijay, I'm just curious, like you talked a little bit in the beginning about some of the limits of BRICS, and it sounds familiar to what we've had conversations about on this show and probably other programs on Breakthrough News about the limits of multipolarity. And you talked a little bit about like the fact that there are some contradictions here, right? In terms of the different kinds of ideological makeups of the governments that are involved, where you have like a far right government in India. Obviously, Brazil has changed, but you have definitely a different ideological makeup, even in Russia, right? Like Russia is not the same as, let's say, as China. So that all that said, can you talk a little bit about the limits? While BRICS is wonderful, like what are the limits that we should be aware of, especially those of us who do want to see a much different, more socialist world where U.S. empire doesn't control everything?
Well, look, things might be clearer on the peace side. Okay, there might be more general agreement between, say, the Indian Foreign Ministry and the Brazilian Foreign Ministry. They don't want the conflict, as an example, in Ukraine to continue because this has downside effects economically, hunger issues and so on. So on peace, I think there's much more agreement. Let's come to the economy. Here, things are interesting. Um, the contingency reserve arrangement, supposed to be the alternative to the International Monetary Fund, the engine for that hasn't been turned on yet. It's still cold. It's still sitting there. They haven't put it on. The new development bank has been lending, and under Dilma, there are more promises. But I'm yet to see whether these are going to be different from the kind of World Bank projects that we've had. Now, you see, you can have any government you want, Rania, in Brazil or in India, but the question isn't the government. It's the permanent bureaucracy that runs the central banks. In Brazil, Mr. Lula's government is in a really a tooth and nail struggle with the central bank around interest rates. It's not been easy for the Lula government to have their way, as it were, when it comes to monetary policy. They are playing a rearguard action. In India, the Reserve Bank of India is fairly conservative. In China, it's a communist government. The Communist Party is in power, People's Republic, and so on. But the monetary policy there is very much run on neoliberal lines, in terms of its central banking. Now, if you're going to have an alternative to the IMF, World Bank, you need a non-neoliberal attitude towards money. You need a different attitude towards lending and financing. This is just not in, the facts don't show this. Thus far, the BRICS project is hampered by the control, really, that neoliberals have over economic policy in the BRICS states and in the project at large. Now, lots of moves to change it, to contest it, but I don't want to walk out of here giving anybody the view that this is some sort of easy administrative decision where somebody just signs a piece of paper and says, now we're going to change policy. And this is a huge struggle. It's a struggle within the economics profession in these countries. It's a struggle within their bureaucracies.
Yeah.
Very important points, all of which can be gone into, I'm sure, more deeply in the 33rd newsletter from the Tricontinental Institute. The BRICS have changed the balance of forces, but they will not by themselves change the world. You can check that out at tricontinental.org, of which our guest Vijay Prashad is the director of. That's the Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, guys.